a chap called Dr. Vernon Coleman. Now, I'm sure anyone all the way through from 2020 right the way through who've been paying attention will have seen Vernon Coleman. They probably either love him or hate him. We were playing many of his excerpts on this programme, and Dr. Vernon Coleman joins me on the line now. Hi, Vernon.
Hello there. Hi, Tony.
Right, now, reason I wanted to have a chat to you is you've just got a new book out, which is a bit of a depressing title, a bit like Steve Hall we had on earlier on, who's written a book called The Death of the Left. You've written one called The End of Medicine. What do you mean by the end of medicine?
It's very simple. What's happened is that the medical establishment, which is one of the most dangerous groups of people on the planet, the medical establishment around the world has decided global warming is real, even though anyone with a brain that it's just a pseudo-scientific cult, and they've put it above the interests of patients. The result of this is that the practice of medicine has changed quite dramatically, and the welfare of patients has been pushed into second place behind global warming. And as a result of that, everything about medicine has changed. And it's changed in a way which is going to result in a massive number of patients suffering, becoming ill, and dying. There's never been anything like this. It is truly the end of medicine as we always thought of it, whereby doctors looked after patients and did their best for them. Now, doctors are putting their priorities, putting global warming as their priority, and patients come second.
Well, when I first saw the title, my immediate thoughts were this must have something to do with assisted dying. So what do you make of that? This is another way where you're going in. I mean, doctors, I thought the idea was do no harm. And now apparently doctors are able to say to their patients, don't you think it would be a good idea if you just took a pill and topped yourself?
I've been campaigning against euthanasia for years, and let's face it, this is actually euthanasia. And there are a whole host of reasons why it's dangerous. If you look what's happening in Canada, people who are poor, people who are disabled, people who are merely miserable, people who are depressed, they're all being allowed to line up for the death camps, the death room. The problem, of course, is that the patients themselves can't kill themselves. They can't give themselves an injection. So actually it's a doctor or somebody, maybe not even a doctor, somebody who's hired to do the killing, who will do the killing. This is state-organized killing. And it is, I suppose it does fit in with the end of medicine, because it's the whole destruction of the relationship between the doctor and the patient. You can't have doctors going around saying to their patients, oh, well, there's not much we can do for you. Would you like us to kill you? That really doesn't work. And the problem is, this is just one small part of what I think, or what I know, is the whole destruction of medical care. You will know, of course, that doctors, by and large now, most of them, don't like to actually see patients. They certainly don't visit patients at home. I was a GP not all that long ago, well, a few decades ago, and I used to visit patients at home, in the daytime, at night time, weekends, Christmas Day. That was the way it worked. But now doctors don't do any visiting, and worse still, they don't even see patients. They like to do everything on the telephone, although now it's not called a telephone call, it's called a virtual appointment. And what you get is the doctor, you ring the doctor, or the doctor rings you back, and he asks you some questions. Now, however good the questions might be, you cannot examine a patient over the telephone. You can't listen to their chest, you can't listen to their heart, you can't take their pulse, you can't look down their throat, you can't look into their eyes, you can't look into their ears, you can't stick fingers into the orifices that doctors have always stuck fingers into quite usefully. You can't do anything. All you can do is provide some sort of superficial reassurance, probably useless, probably dangerous, and they're extending that now to virtual wards. And patients, instead of going into hospital, heaven forbid, patients are being given a telephone call, and they're being treated and looked after while they're at home. Now that sounds, when you think about it, that sounds as if it might be quite good. But it isn't, because the patients aren't linked up to the hospital. What they get is somebody from the hospital rings up and says, are you okay? and the patient, being a polite person, says, yes, I'm all right, thanks, and the doctor says, good, thanks, bye, and that's it. But your consultation lasts less time than a wrong number. The number of things that are happening is quite extraordinary. For example, a lot of people who have asthma will know that their doctor has said, those old inhalers that you were using, they're really bad for the climate. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you something new. It's a nice new drug that contains a steroid. And if anybody knows anything about medicine, they'll know that giving loads and loads of children and asthmatics regular doses of a steroid inhaler isn't necessarily the best thing in the world to do, but it's probably better for the climate, so they say. Better in some way to preventing global warming, which doesn't exist anyway. So all of these things are happening, and the big medical organizations are all joined in changing medicine. It's all happening very quietly. A lot of people don't even know that it's happening. The World Health Organization issued a list of instructions for doctors. My favorite one on the list was to doctors, this was, from the WHO, don't debate the science. Don't debate the science with patients. Well, of course they don't want to debate the science, because once they start debating the science, they'll look like complete idiots, and the whole thing will fall apart, because there isn't any science. The science is all the other way. The science simply shows that weather changes, and in fact it's getting cooler, not warmer, which is why they have to change it from global warming to climate change. The problem that we've got is that the medical establishment, for whatever reason, and personally I think it's all tied in with the depopulation plan, which is quite well proven and established. It's all tied in with that, because they know damn well that if they withdraw proper medical care, which is what they're doing, then an awful lot of people are going to die. And the whole argument of the fake COVID pandemic, which I first started to expose in February and March of 2020 for my sins, that whole fake pandemic was designed to bring in the COVID vaccine, which was, in my opinion, and in the opinion of quite a number of people, the most toxic product ever produced.
Well, look, Vernon, can I just ask you about another aspect of all of this, which is my experience recently. A friend of mine went into hospital. The medical staff, and particularly some kind of sister in charge of the ward, seemed to be very reluctant to allow the relatives and friends in to see the patient. And also, in that particular operation, they were using fentanyl, and the fentanyl wasn't doing anything. They were using fentanyl more and more, and this individual was in a lot of pain. And eventually, they had to themselves say, "Look, I'm in pain." And finally, they eventually started to use some morphine, which sorted the whole thing out. So there seems to be a sort of political correctness where everybody knows in the medical books that this morphine or whatever is the right thing to use, but someone somewhere down the line has said, we'd rather you use this stuff instead. And of course, if you're using something, a different product, then that's a different company which is getting the benefit of the spending on these drugs. So there seems to be quite a lot of interference in all the sort of medical ethics of people going into hospital at all.
Absolutely, and in fact, they don't really want people to go into hospital, which is one of the reasons why waiting lists have been allowed to get so enormously long. In Britain, waiting lists are fairly unique to Britain, and they're unique because we have a very strange system. This is how they originated. Consultants in the NHS, in the National Health Service, are allowed to see patients privately if they agree to a 9/11 contract. The other 2/11 of their time they can spend with private patients. And as a consultant told me, probably nearly 60 years ago now, he said, if you do not keep your NHS waiting list long, who the devil is going to pay you to go privately? So that's what's been happening for all of those years, and that's one of the main reasons why the NHS is crumbling. There are lots of other reasons. But to go back to the point you were making about drugs, that's exactly right. That's the thing I was talking about with the asthma drugs. The same thing's happening with antibiotics. Doctors don't like prescribing antibiotics because it's bad for the climate. And as a result, if you look at the figures for the number of people dying from sepsis, they're rocketing. Gases used in anesthetics have been changed. No one's really tested to see whether the new anesthetic drugs that they're using are as good or better than the ones that they've been using for decades. It's just that the ones that they've been using for decades are apparently bad for global warming. The reason I mentioned vaccines earlier on is because vaccines, mass vaccination, is part of the future. What they want to do is to replace the drugs that have been used, many of which are very good. I have been the first to complain about drugs forever and a day because of the problems that they can produce. But on the other hand, if you don't prescribe antibiotics, more people will die of infections. If you don't prescribe the right asthma drugs, more people will get serious asthma, and so on and so on. But doctors, led on by the drug companies, can see the vast amounts of money and the very little work involved. Instead of giving people drugs, you just vaccinate them all the time against everything. And remember that GPs don't actually give the vaccines themselves. They get someone to do it for them. The average GP, by the way, now works in Britain, now works 23 hours a week. 23 hours a week is the average working week of a GP. And there are reasons for that. But the problem is that the doctors know that it's a very good way to make a stonking good living. I worked out that during the COVID pandemic, the average GP was making 50 grand a year by telling nurses or wherever else, somebody with a white coat, to give COVID jabs to people from the fees that they were getting, the massive fees they were getting as being encouraged to give COVID jabs. I get invitations to have the COVID jab.
Well, look, I mean, this is a whole other question, isn't it? In a way, it's a sort of sociological, philosophical question about why people become doctors. I mean, people, do they become a doctor because they like the idea of having a lifetime career where you're helping other people get well who are sick, or do you do it because you've got big pound signs in your eyes?
The problems all changed 50 years ago. There were all sorts of things that changed. One of the things that changed, and I'm wary about saying this because people will jump on me and say I'm being sexist. I'm not. Exactly the opposite. In about 50 years ago, it was decreed that there should be more women doctors. Now, there was no logical reason for this apart from the obvious there should be more women. Nobody was saying there should be more male ballet dancers or there should be more male postmasters or whatever. They just said there should be more women doctors. Now, the consequence of this has not been, I'm not saying that women doctors care less or work less, but the whole enrollment at medical school system changed. And people were chosen, students were chosen according to their sex more than anything else because they had to fill up the number of female students. And what they knew at the time was that a lot of those women doctors would want to work part-time, which is one of the main reasons why doctors work an average of 23 hours a week. It's because a lot of them are women, and they don't want to work a full week for whatever reasons. They don't want to pay the tax, they want to look after their kids, they want to do something else. Doesn't matter. The point is that everything changed. And at that point, 50 years ago, when they changed the rules about medical schools, it was not long after that they changed the rules about how general practice operated. And the rules about general practice, previously, GPs had been on a 365-day, 24-hour-a-day responsibility for their patients. That changed very quickly, and doctors were given the option of just working an ordinary 40-hour week, or as it happens, a 23-hour week. And the result of that, of course, has been a massive pressure on hospitals because accident and emergency units can't cope because 3 o'clock in the morning a little Johnny develops a pain from an earache You can't ring the GP anymore. People used to just ring the GP, he'd toss around, give an appropriate treatment, little Johnny would be fine, and the doctor would go back to bed, and the patients would be happy. Now, little Johnny's mum and dad wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning because little Johnny's screaming, and they put him in the car, or they ring an ambulance, and they take him to the accident and emergency department to be treated. And that's why there are massive queues, and people waiting in the accident and emergency units can wait days, especially if they're elderly, because anyone over 70 is given negative priority. So even if you've got a broken leg or a broken arm, if you're old, you just have to wait and wait and wait. The ambulance services can't cope because of the massive increase in the number of people wanting to be taken to hospital, many of whom could be treated quite successfully by their GP if the GP were available, which he's not because there isn't any nighttime or weekend service. This has been happening for some time. It's not new. It's the destruction of medical care. It's a total destruction, and it's been accelerated in the last couple of years very late by the deliberate decision to put global warming first and patients second.
Well, look, Vernon, when I think of you, I think of my sort of hero doctors, really, people who've actually spoken, the sort of doctor that I would actually like to have as my GP, because I think, I'm not quite sure who it was, but recently I think it was Dr. Bob Gill in London. We asked him about how do you tell if your GP is actually switched on or not, or if they're just following what they're told through various medical journals. And he said the best thing to do is you can ask them about ivermectin. And that's one of the simple things to do, to ask them about that. And if they say, well, yes, this is actually quite useful in respiratory diseases like COVID, but the government suppressed it, you've got a live one. And if they say it's a horse dewormer, then you may as well get a new GP. But anyway, one of the other doctors, not in a GP in this case, as far as I know, that stands out for me right the way through the COVID business is this guy, Dr. Andrew Wakefield. I wonder what you make of him, Vernon.
The paper that got him into trouble with the General Medical Council, the paper that was in the Lancet, it was about MMR. I believe the argument was that vaccines can be related to autism and to a whole host of other diseases, and that they damage the immune system. I can't remember precisely what Andrew Wakefield said, but he got vilified inevitably because the medical establishment, the General Medical Council, leaps on anybody who dares to say vaccines are bad. And indeed, the whole establishment, the whole media. The BBC actually said, we do not interview anyone who criticises vaccines or vaccination, whether they're right or wrong. The establishment, the General Medical Council, the BBC, the mainstream media, the government, everybody loves vaccines. But if you look at a chart of death rates from things like whooping cough or almost any other disease that you can think of, the death rates fell before the vaccines were introduced. The vaccines didn't stop those diseases. Those diseases were already being stopped by better food, better water, and so on.
Well, one of the points that Wakefield makes is, particularly with the MMR, with diseases like mumps and measles, is what the vaccine does is totally counterproductive, because it only works for a certain number of years, and it means that if and when you do get measles and mumps, it's later in life where it's actually much more dangerous. It's far better to have it when you're younger. And of course, we've got this massive cocktail of different vaccines, which was being injected into newborn children now, if the mums will allow it. And I can remember myself as a reporter back in the 1990s, at the BBC, interviewing people about Gulf War syndrome. And the most useful conclusion that the various people who'd looked into that, including people who'd suffered with it, had said was, well, we got all these jabs when we went out to the Gulf. We got lots of them all together. And, of course, you can have one jab, which has been tested and safe. But if you're getting 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 jabs, and now we seem to be, Vernon, doing this to newborn babies.
They are. By the time a kid goes to school, they've had I don't know how many jabs. To go back to what you were saying about getting infections better when you're younger. When I was a kid, mothers had chickenpox parties. One kid got chickenpox, they had a party, all the other kids went along, so they'd get chickenpox then. That was the way it was dealt with, and it was much more effective. The problem with vaccines, as you said, they're being hammered into people. And they're being hammered into people of all ages now. It's not just children. As I said, I get heaven knows how many invitations by mail, phone, text, email to go along and have my whatever the latest vaccine for old folk is. But there's never been any tests done to see whether it's safe to have 10, 20, 30.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's another aspect to all of this, and that is consent. You know, maybe nobody should be ever given a vaccine until they reach the age of 18 or 21 where they can actually give proper consent for it. I mean, how can you say when you get to 18, I didn't really want all those vaccines that were given to me when I was a tiny tot?
The problem is, nowadays, that the whole system is pro-vaccine, and parents who say, I don't want to have my child vaccinated, are quite likely to have social workers come around, policemen come around, and have their child taken off them. And there's another thing as well. These things just keep banging into my head, but there's another thing as well. You think of the number of children who were on drugs of one sort or another, for whatever ADHD or asthma or whatever. No one's done any tests to see what the interaction effect is between all those vaccines that they're having and the drugs that they're taking. It's hardly surprising that there's an enormous amount of illness around. It's hardly surprising that cancer amongst young adults is massively increasing. They look at all the possible things that they can blame for it, and some of them are quite absurd. They never, ever, ever look to see whether it could be vaccines that are causing all these cancers, to see whether it could be vaccines that are causing all the other problems that are affecting people, or whether vaccines could be affecting the immune system, which they damn well are.
Well, there's another sort of bit of a hero, if I can invoke a few of these people. His name is Dr. Chris Exley. He's known as Dr. Aluminium. And I interviewed him during, I think it was around about 2021. And he explained that aluminium is used in all these, many of these vaccines. They call them vaccines. Some of them really aren't. They are, we just call it a COVID jab. If it's an mRNA jab, it's not really a vaccine at all. And his argument was that actually a lot of this is toxic to you, and it stays in your body. Your body can't really get rid of it unless you've got the right sort of minerals to get rid of it, which are difficult to obtain. And that, again, this is potentially going to give you Alzheimer's when you're older, unless you're able to deal with that. So this is another aspect to it all, isn't it? That you've got doctors like him that have been researching this, and then funnily enough, Keele University say, oh, actually, we're getting money from other companies that are getting a lot more than for you, and they have asked us to get rid of you. I don't think they actually said that, but it was pretty clear that he was kicked out of Keele University because the university itself wanted funding from the pharmaceutical industry.
The pharmaceutical industry is enormously powerful. I've been having a running battle, pretty one-sided, I'm afraid, for most of my life. When I was attacking the drug industry when I was a medical student, because it didn't seem to me that what they were doing was right and proper, and it sort of seemed that doctors had been bought and were lock, stock and barrel. My first book in 1975 was called The Medicine Den, about the influence of the pharmaceutical industry on doctors. And since then, I've had a big circle on my back, which they've been firing out regularly. It's the pharmaceutical industry that has been very much behind the banning. I'm banned from all social media, from doing videos on virtually anywhere, all mainstream media, and that can be traced back basically to the pharmaceutical industry. They just shut up anybody that they don't approve of, anybody who says things which criticize their products, because they don't like anybody criticizing their products. And if you look at the amount of billions of dollars in compensation that drug companies have had to pay, it's phenomenal. And you can look at almost any vaccine that they produce, making massive profits out of it. And you look at the side effects that have been caused by it, and then you try and look to see, has that particular vaccine helped people? And time and time and time again, you find that not only has the vaccine not helped people, but the vaccine has actually caused a massive amount of illness. The drug companies just make a vaccine, sell it until they actually get stopped. And it actually takes quite a long time for that to happen because, of course, doctors who might find that there was something wrong with a vaccine, they'll usually find that their research has been quietly lost.
Well, you're lucky that you didn't end up like Brandy Vaughan. She was working for Merck and blew the whistle about one of their... I think she was was a particular vaccine that they had, and then she was murdered. So you have to count yourself lucky, Vernon.
Well, our car had the two front tyres. The inner part of the two front tyres were cut down so that the car, the two tyres would collapse. It was found by the garage because routinely it went in for a service, and they found that the tyres had been cut very professionally. So they've tried. We try and protect ourselves as much as possible because they've done everything to shut me up. And of course, the only real way to provide any protection is to keep talking and keep exposing the...
Well, that's funny because I thought you were going to say to keep silent.
You thought what, sorry?
I thought you were going to say the only way to keep them away is to keep silent.
Well, that's one way. The other way is keep talking.
Well, I think the other thing is if you keep silent, then they wait for a while and then they'll have you.
Well, that's probably true. Anyway, keeping silent isn't an option because I'm an ornery old and I'm very cross about the way medicine has been destroyed. The medical profession has been taken over, lost all its... I loved medicine and doctoring and so on, but all that has been destroyed, utterly destroyed. You get doctors now who refuse to see patients. As I said, they just hide behind the telephone. The elderly patients just never get seen. People just die without ever being properly treated. The medicine fell apart, really, when doctors stopped doing house calls and when they stopped doing night calls, because there was actually something enormously satisfying.
Yeah. Well, I would say the same about broadcasting. You know, that actually the same kind of thing happened around about the early 1990s. You know, it used to be great fun. All of a sudden you found people who you most respected. I mean, I can remember a beautiful guy that used to come into the BBC to do, he would do a kind of nature talk once a month. It was the best thing on all week on our little local radio station, Wiltshire Sound, based in... he used to come into Salisbury, but it was in Swindon. And you would get a fantastic, like, just that month's... loads of stuff about that month's nature, whether it's flora, fauna, things he'd noticed, someone that knew the countryside back to front. And then suddenly it was, we don't want him anymore. We're getting rid of him. They don't like freelancers. They just want staff people. And, of course, all the staff people they were bringing in were youngsters who had absolutely not a clue. So it was, to me, that was the time, I don't know what it was in medicine, that I actually witnessed broadcasting turn for something which was benefiting the listener to something which was rather sinister, actually. The idea was that someone somewhere was pulling all the strings and only certain views were going to be heard.
Exactly, that's exactly what's happened. It's happened in education, it's happened in the law, it's happened in all the professions, it's happened everywhere. And it's for me, I've spent all my life, I mean, I've sat in two chairs. I've been a doctor, but I've also been in the media for a long time. And I've seen the days when a columnist, I was a columnist for quite a few national newspapers, and I was given total freedom for quite a long time. If I wanted to say something, I was allowed to say it. But in more recent years, that freedom slowly disappeared, and everybody, editors and publishers and whatever, became more and more concerned with making sure that what they did didn't upset the government or whoever else was pulling the strings. And to go back to the COVID thing, the newspapers were totally and utterly bent. Like the BBC was totally and utterly bent. And the whole of the media, the mainstream media, and much, it has to be said, of the so-called alternative media on the internet was bent, because they were just doing what they were told to do, huge amounts of in advertising. You remember the Nationals during the COVID hoax? The Nationals were full of full-page adverts with pictures of little doctors on saying, "Oh, well, you must go and off and get your jab to save the world." There was never any question in any of them. Is this a good thing that we're doing? Is this necessary? Are the lockdowns really useful? Are any of these things right? In the old days, what you and I would call the good days of broadcasting and newspapers and so on, there would have been both points of view would have been put in a newspaper. You'd have one page which said, yes, lockdowns are great, and on the other page you'd have a feature saying, no, lockdowns are bad.
Well, what worries me is that we haven't seen in many articles recently saying how we've got to make peace with Russia and we shouldn't have a war with them. I mean, you would have thought that was an obvious one side of a certain discussion. And I don't think there's many people out there who would like to sign up to join the army to fight the Russians. I don't think you find anybody unless they're absolutely desperate. And even then, it's pretty unlikely. Now, look, I just want to ask you, so I've got a clip here of you, Vernon. It's a bit cruel of me to do this, bounce this onto you. But this is you back in 1981. It's over, 44 years ago. And we're just going to hear from a young Vernon Coleman who was a doctor. Were you in Hampshire or somewhere like that?
I was in Warwickshire.
Warwickshire, okay. Well, anyway, it was the local ITV interviewed you about a certain topic, and that was the idea that the DSS were going to be able to have a look at people's medical records to see if they really were sick back in 1981. So let's have a listen to that now. It's just about a minute or so long.
If you're pregnant, or you've got venereal disease, or you've got asthma, or you're depressed, or you're suffering from anxiety, I think all these things and a lot of other things are problems which people would very much like to keep between themselves and their doctor. From depression, for example, and you work for a large company, you may find that your future role in that company is diminished because the bosses may feel that you're not suitable for promotion. So a simple word on a sick note can ruin a man's career. I think at the moment I'm still bending it. I'm prepared to break it, but I'm still bending it at the moment.
Wouldn't it be simpler for you just to bow to the rules?
Well, there are lots of simpler ways of dealing with it, of course. I could just simply be slightly dishonest and write flu on all the sick notes. But it seems like a slightly easy way out.
Now, you say you're prepared to break the rules. This could cost you £1,000 fine or even more, so how far are you prepared to go?
Yes, well, I suppose eventually they could stop me practicing within the health service. But I feel this is so important that it's a basic principle of medical practice, that confidentiality between patient and doctor is of vital importance. And the rules and regulations of the DHSS must come second to that. And if the rules say that I can't maintain confidentiality, then the rules will have to go, or I'll have to go.
Well, that's quite brave of you to say that, Vernon, that either the rules will have to go or I'll have to go.
Yeah, well, I went. They fined me and fined me and fined me, and I refused to. Gosh, I'd forgotten all about all that.
Well, maybe you could just tell us what was going on with that then, because am I right in guess? I was guessing that that's what the government were trying to do, was to try to break this confidentiality between patient and doctor.
Well, they broke it because the General Medical Council eventually decided that the Hippocratic Oath was outdated and they didn't really need to bother with it, and confidentiality wasn't the flavour of the month. What they did, I actually did. I scribbled on the sick notes. I had patients who came in and said, "Look, you have to put what's wrong with me on my sick note, because if you do, I remember I had a patient come in and he was depressed, and he said, if you write depressed on that sick note, they'll fire me. Things was different in those days. And I had a woman who came in and said, if you put pregnant on there, they'll fire me. And so on and so on. And I thought, this isn't right. Why should doctors ever...
Oh, I see. So the people would have to then take those notes into work and show them to their bosses?
Yeah. They did actually change the rules a little bit in the end, but not quick enough for me. But there you go. I steadfastly refused. And I remember going to some tribunal, and they had a huge pile of these sick notes. And the committee said, we can't read any of the diagnoses that you put on. And they were all just squiggles. And I said, I apologise for my handwriting. Gave them to me and said, well, they said, well, can you tell us what these are? And I said, I think they're all flu.
So this is when the doctor was on the side of the patient, batting for the patient. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a few journalists who were batting for the viewers and batting for the listeners too? Anyway, Vernon, look, you're what do you put this down to? You're obviously someone who's thinks a bit outside the box, and is certainly not afraid of going outside what the establishment are trying to nudge you towards. What do you put this trait in your character down to?
Bloody-mindedness, I suppose. I know I've never found it easy to accept authority unless what the authority was doing and saying made sense or seemed right. And I've always believed in the freedom of individuals, the real freedom of individuals, to be able to say and do what they want. If people want to say that everyone should have a vaccine, and everybody wants to have a vaccine, then so be it. I'll try and argue against them, but I'm not going to stop people doing things. And I get very upset when people try and stop me saying things or stop me doing things just because they're frightened that I might manage to influence people by saying something or by producing some evidence. And I've always tried to produce evidence since I've been tried to produce evidence which proves my point. And for example, going back to the wretched COVID, in 2020, before the vaccines were rolled out, I found and produced evidence that was taken down very quickly that the vaccines would cause a whole range of neurological problems. They would cause heart problems. They would cause blood clotting. They would cause strokes. And so on and so on and so on. And all that happened was there was never any debate about this, which there should have been, of course. All that happened was that the videos were taken down, and I was jeered at and suppressed and subjected to a whole range of indignity.
One thing that you've said is this thing about sort of reducing population. I don't know if that's eugenics, population reduction, the idea that someone out there would rather reduce the world's population. I know King Charles has said this in the past, that we need 3 worlds in order to actually support the number of people that are on planet Earth right now. So that obviously implies that we need to kill 2/3 of the world's population. Do you think this is credible, and if so, why?
It's not a credible argument at all. There's plenty of food on the planet. Most of it's in the wrong place.
Yeah, but what about the are there people out there that want to kill millions or even billions of people?
There are huge numbers of very powerful people who believe that the world is massively overpopulated. You look at some of the stuff that the World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, you look at what these people have said, and the idea of getting rid of what they call useless eaters, which takes us back to euthanasia, of course, because in countries where they've already got euthanasia or doctor-assisted suicide or whatever you want to call it, in countries like that, what's happening is that people are being allowed or encouraged to kill themselves if they don't have a job or if they're disabled or in some way because they're considered to be, quotes, useless eaters, quotes. And that's a phrase which has been bandied around amongst the very powerful people who do believe that there's too many people. There's no evidence that there's too many people. One of the problems, of course, is that the oil's running out, and the very rich and powerful want more of it for themselves and less of it for other people. It's not a question of food. There's plenty of food around. There's plenty of land around. It's not a question of any of that. It's just simply a question of control, which is not something I think is right. I don't think people should... one of the arguments during the euthanasia debate was that people who feel that they're a burden should be allowed to kill themselves. Actually, they wouldn't kill themselves. Somebody would do it for them because they wouldn't be able to do it themselves because of technology and so on. But, I mean, what sort of world are we in when people are saying, if you feel worthless... I'll tell you something else about euthanasia. You know, 9 out of 10 of people who try to commit suicide, which is what this form of euthanasia is being sold as, they say afterwards, it was a terrible mistake, I didn't want to do it really, and now I'm glad I didn't, because my life's turned around.
Oh, you know, that's such an important point to make, isn't it? I've spoken to several, you know, in my lifetime, several people who were so pleased that a suicide attempt wasn't successful. Amazing, you're absolutely right. And that hasn't really been touched on at all. So, anyway, your latest book is called The End of Medicine, Vernon. I wondered, I mean, it's about this whole business of global warming and its effect. But what about, I mean, some of your, I think if someone is coming to you maybe for the first time and wanting some advice, I can remember years ago seeing a book of yours in the bookshop upstairs from my office. It was called How to Stop Your Doctor Killing You. And I think, in a way, it's the best title of any of the books you've ever written, because that's what people want to know. They know there's an absolute minefield out there. There's some really good doctors out there, like Dr. Mercola in the United States. The people at Children's Health Defence seem to be doing a very, very good job. But you really do need to know how to stop your doctor killing you. When a doctor advises you to go through a procedure, take a drug, maybe have an operation, you need to know, is this for my own good, or is this feathering the nest of some drug company? You need to know the answer to that question now. So I wonder, what books would you recommend of your own that help people make those decisions?
How to Stop Your Doctor Killing You is still around, new version, because when that book first came out, I remember going to Portugal. I had my agent there took me and just a book cover with the title on it to a publisher in Portugal, and he saw the book cover with the title on, and I jumped up and down. I said, "I'll buy this now. I want the book. How quickly can you write the book?" Because he thought it was a snappy title too. The answer is to be aware, and How to Stop Your Doctor Killing You is probably the book that answers the questions of exactly what sort of things you need to know from your doctor. And it's a long time since I looked at it, but I did look at it, and it's up to date. But it's a long time since I read it.
And what about that question I asked my doctor about ivermectin? Have you got any other good questions that you can ask your GP? Just sort of drop it into the conversation, so you get an indication of where they're coming from in terms of the profession.
Here's a good one. Are there any side effects with vaccines? If he says, no, there are no side effects with vaccines, get out of the chair, however pull you feel, and run like stink, because he's a lunatic. No, I'm serious. You obviously mustn't get up and run out of the...
Well, I mean, another thing is, just in the news this week, is this whole idea of chemically castrating people instead of keeping them in prison.
Yeah, well, the problem with doing things like that is that if you make a mistake, as the judicial system seems to be doing with monotonous regularity, if you send somebody to prison for 40 years by mistake, you can at least attempt to make some sort of reparation. But if you chemically castrate them, that's pretty final, isn't it? It's a sort of light version of hanging them. I'm not wild about doctors being involved in any sort of punishment regime, because the doctor's job is to look after people, not to kill them or maim them. It's to try to diagnose people and then to try to cure them. And when I gave up being a GP, which I didn't have a lot of choice over, because of the business with the confidentiality of the sick notes, where I refused to kowtow, and I decided, and I became basically a book writer. Although I did a lot of broadcasting, but I became a book writer. I decided that instead of treating patients retail, I'd treat patients wholesale and try to explain to people how they could best look for ways to treat themselves and ways to make sure that they got a good deal out of their doctor. And actually the end of medicine also, I tried to include advice on how people could try to protect themselves and look after themselves. And there's actually a very good book, which I didn't write, about, I can't remember the title of it. Hang on, I've got my book here. It's actually, it's a book for people, captains on ships, when obviously you have an emergency and there isn't a doctor around. I'll be there in a second. It's called The Ship Captain's Medical Guide.
Right.
And it's brilliant. I bought one to have a look at it, and I was terribly impressed, because whatever it is, it's got advice. Because don't forget, if you're on a ship and you haven't got a doctor, which most commercial ships obviously don't, the captain's responsible, and he's got to know what to do.
Yeah.
The government produces it, or some government department. You have to hold your nose a bit about that. But I found it amazingly good information, because that's all it is. It's just information. What do you do in an emergency when there isn't a doctor around? And a lot of the time, that's what people are going to have to do now, because there'll be lots of emergencies and not a lot of doctors around.
Yeah, well, and also not a lot of trustworthy. Seems to me the problem, because, I mean, it's almost as if some of the Dr. Mengele characters have been allowed to run riot. Certainly in the last 5 or 6 years. And, I mean, we did look in... I mean, I personally got COVID back in 2019, before it was kind of supposed to exist. At least I had all the symptoms of the official COVID, where you can't smell and all these kind of things. It was a really very nasty flu. Anyway, but I wonder what you make... I'm going to play a clip now, Vernon. I hope you don't mind hanging on. It's only about a minute or so long, but it's from an RT, Russia Today piece recently, which looked at... I mean, Mengele and the Nazis are quite well known, but apparently the Japanese were up to this too. And it's almost as if these people have now kind of come back. After 80 or so years since World War II, when we thought we'd got rid of them all, they're back again. Anyway, it'd be interesting to get your comment after we've heard this.
In 1932, microbiologist and Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii led Japan's first biological weapons program, which expanded in 1936 into a massive facility in Pingfang. The complex, staffed by thousands and equipped with labs, operating rooms, barracks and cremation sites, became the heart of the Unit 731. From 1933 to 1945, the unit carried out gruesome human experiments to explore the defensive and offensive potential of pathogens like typhoid, cholera, anthrax, tetanus, and the plague. Cruel medical experiments, vivisections, exposure to freezing conditions, suffocation, as well as deadly diseases were inflicted on prisoners of war, primarily Chinese and Russian, along with some Mongolians and Koreans. These atrocities claimed lives of over 3,000 defenseless victims. According to the unit members, the true number of victims could be much higher. Here's how one participant described one of the unit's so-called experiments.
Well, we'll leave it there. But Vernon, what do you make of this? I mean, some might call me a conspiracy theorist for even bringing it up, but it does seem as if, particularly with the COVID jabs, that was a massive human experiment, and this is totally banned in any kind of moral and ethical world.
Experiments carried on all the time now with like, as I was explaining in the end of medicine, the changes which they're making, new products for old products that are well tried and useful, the changes that they're making, reduction in the number of antibiotics and so on, these have not been tested and tried. They've just leapt on these new ideas. And we're now in the situation, I think the most of the doctors in what I call the medical establishment, which is of course the medical establishment, most of the doctors who are running the medical establishment are just as guilty as Mengele. They're condoning experimental procedures. They're not questioning what's happening. They're not looking at the reasons why things happen. They're not assessing. Doctors have now officially diagnosed 9 million people in Britain with autism. Do you think maybe it might be time to actually look at whether this is right and whether there might be a cause? Could it be anything to do with vaccines?
Yeah, maybe Andrew Wakefield was right, and this was directly linked to it.
I put money betting that he was right and the medical establishment was wrong, because most of the time the medical establishment is wrong. If you look historically at the number of when Semmelweis first found the link between puerperal fever and the fact that medical students weren't washing their hands after they'd been in the mortuary, he was laughed at. Everything in medicine that's been developed and been introduced before Joseph Lister, surgeons used to sharpen their knife on the soles of their boots, never change their clothes, never wash their hands, and 99% of people who went into the operating theatre died. And then Lister started trying to take care to be a bit cleaner and so on, and to spray carbolic in the atmosphere in the operating theatre, and the number of people dying fell by 90%. The medical establishment obviously opposed it viciously and said this is. You have to remember that doctors promoted smoking as a good way to clear people's chests. The medical establishment, by and large, has always got everything wrong.
Well, look, before we just ask you about where people can get hold of the book, Vernon, it is so lovely that you were promoting some other book rather than your own book when I asked you about that, what people can read. But what about the other side of things where, I do find that quite often I would much rather a doctor said something about actually, change your diet, use this in your diet, and how can we look after our bodies without using drugs or the medical system in terms of what we eat, and particularly look after our own immune system?
The immune systems need vitamin D. During the lockdowns, I made one of the many videos I made, which was deleted very quickly, suggested that because of the fact that people weren't getting any sunshine, they should take extra vitamin D or take vitamin D supplements, make sure that their immune systems were carefully protected in that way. That video was taken down in minutes, inevitably, and yet that's good, solid, protective medicine. There's an awful lot of talk about the fat jabs protecting people because they have an anti-inflammatory effect. If you look at the list of side effects, which I've put in the end of medicine, you wouldn't want to touch any of them with a barge pole, I must confess. But there is actually a drug which is rather cheaper, which has a good anti-inflammatory effect, and there are quite a lot of doctors who now recommend taking a 75 milligram aspirin tablet, particularly if you have cancer or if you're over 50. Is aspirin, because it has a very powerful anti-inflammatory effect. But of course, drug companies never recommend aspirin. Medical journalists never recommend aspirin because it's cheap. And where's the profit in recommending that? Where's the profit in recommending diets? Where's the profit in telling people they eat too much fat? And telling people not to eat fatty meat? And so on and so on. There's very little useful preventive medicine out there because there's not a lot of profit in it. There's not a lot of money to be made out of telling people how to change their lifestyle in order to improve their health and their longevity. But there's a hell of a lot of profit to be made out of jabbing everyone with a whole pile of vaccines which have probably never been properly tested and which have certainly never been tested.
Yeah, and also the sort of getting people who have got some sort of potentially chronic illness to get stuck into being chronic in that illness and then having a regular drug to feed them. Anyway, look, so whereabouts, I mean, I don't know if you're doing any book signings or that sort of thing, but if people are interested in getting your latest, The End of Medicine, with all these things in, or any of your other books, where's the best place to go?
Through the bookshop on my website, Vernon, www.vernoncoleman.com. There's a bookshop there, but the website's all entirely free. There's no adverts, there's no sponsorship. It's just piles and piles and piles of articles telling people my view on whatever the latest nonsense is, or how to stay fit and healthy and avoid all the problems which are multiplying around us all the time.
Okay, Dr. Vernon Coleman, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.